with infection of the red blood cell and adhesion. And we said that the malarial parasite produces adhesive proteins that go to the outside of the red blood cell and cause the adhesion of these red blood cells to the endothelium. This can cause clumping of the red blood cells, forming a clot. It can also lead to adhesion in the placenta, if there is a placenta, and this can cause obstruction of the blood flow to the fetus. Okay, so this is important in the transmission of the disease and in what symptoms it causes. Okay, so we said that, just want to reiterate some of this because I know it was the end of the hour. We said that this cyclical fever is due to the 2 to 3 days that it takes for the toxin to burst these red blood cells. And every 2 to 3 days they're going to burst, releasing a wave of these myrizoites from the red blood cells, and that leads to the fever. When these red blood cells burst, what has happened? What has happened to your red blood cell count? It's gone down. So this is directly due to the, linked to the anemia that we see with these patients. Okay, so lysis of the red blood cells by the myrizoites causes loss of red blood cells, and that causes anemia. Now, as these red blood cells don't divide, right? They're made and then they die, essentially. So red blood cells are made in the erythropoietic portion of the bone marrow, and they are killed off in what organ? The spleen, right? So they're killed off in the spleen. They go to the spleen to be essentially wasted and degenerated in the spleen. The reason why this adhesion protein is important to the myrizoite in this red blood cell is that so this infected red blood cell doesn't go to the spleen, okay? Because if it's adhering to the vasculature, it's not going to make its way to the spleen and be destroyed. Thereby, the parasite can just continue the cycle, right? And so this adhesion also decreases destruction of red blood cells in the spleen. And this can cause hemorrhage or cardiovascular issues. Okay, hemorrhage or cardiovascular issues. Okay, so we said that pulmonary edema, for example, was one of the symptoms. If this is happening in the lungs, you essentially have a clot in the lungs, you're going to get edema forming there. Okay, so the exchange of gas in the lungs won't be efficient. It's going to start building up fluid as a result. Okay, so this adhesion is very important in the symptoms, particularly the more severe symptoms that humans get as a result of this infection. All right, so finally, some of these myrizoites differentiate into gametocytes, and gametocytes is exactly what it says. It's a gamete, so it's essentially reverting from adult to baby. Okay, reverting from adult to baby, and this is done asexually. We're not going to go into the details of that, but the gametocytes can then be picked up by the next Anopheles female mosquito that comes in and takes a bite, and then it's free to go and infect someone else. Any questions about this? We said a lot here. Okay, so make sure you understand this cycle and the importance of these two things over here as far as adhesion goes. All right, if we look at the human malarias, again, there's 4 species. Falciparum is the typical malaria that's very good at causing the red blood cell clumping, restricting blood flow, and causing anemia. These other 3 can be prevalent as well. You can see some of the features of these. The Vivax is very good at causing rupture of the spleen. And so this is very bad because the spleen is full of blood, and if the spleen ruptures, you better tie it up quickly, remove it and tie it up quickly, or else this patient's going to bleed out. Okay? There's just some differences here between the species. Again, falciparum is the one that's going to cause the vast majority of infections. Interestingly, patients that are heterozygous for sickle cell, these patients contain two hemoglobin alleles. One is the HbA, but instead of the HbB allele, they have the sickle cell trait. Okay? This tends to sickle the red blood cells. They're not shaped, and you guys have heard of sickle cell before in the past, so I'm not going to get into it. But the shape of the red blood cell changes such that these people are offered intrinsic resistance from malaria. Okay? So people with the sickle cell allele will be intrinsically resistant because the malarial infection cannot infect their red blood cells. So how do we treat malaria? We have a wide variety of drugs to do so. Some of them are very good, but resistance is a problem with treatment of malaria. All right, the first one is the worst one, quinine and quinidine. Quinine is an alkaloid. It's obtained from the bark of a tree, the cinchona tree. It's a South American tree, and it has very long vines. And the Peruvian, there are no such thing as American Incas. Peruvian Incas in the 1600s were using this to treat fever, the extract of the bark to treat fever, most likely that was caused by malaria. So quinine is shown here, and I don't care that you know anything about the chemistry, but there are four stereocenters, 4 chiral centers here. And so quinine and quinidine are essentially the same compound, but they are enantiomerically distinct. So you can see that 3R is 3R, 4S is 4S, but the 8 and 9 positions are inverted. Okay? So this is the difference only in chirality, but the two drugs are identical. Okay? Quinine and quinidine will act primarily as blood myrizoiticide. Okay, for all Plasmodium species, myrizoiticide. It's essentially going to kill the myrizoites that are in the blood, remember, right here, after the liver stage. Okay? It's going to kill those off by 3 different hypothesized mechanisms. One is DNA intercalation. That means it's intercalating. It's sticking itself in between base pairs within the plasmodial DNA. The second one is interference with hemoglobin digestion. And the third one is interference with protozoal DHFR, dihydrofolate reductase. Okay. These drugs are quite toxic, particularly quinidine. The fatal dose is 2 grams. Okay? So that's not a whole lot. You think of, patient taking 500 milligrams. Well, 2 grams is only 4 times that much. Okay? So the fatal dose is very low. It's rarely going to be a drug of choice unless you see resistance to the other antimalarials. When I worked in retail pharmacy in the, mid-90s? Yeah, about early to mid-90s. Quinine was sold over the counter for leg cramps because it relaxes skeletal muscle. And so people would actually come say, I'd like to get a bottle of quinine, and we'd say, sure, $3. Don't kill yourself. In 1996, the FDA put a stop to that due to toxicity, so it's not sold over the counter anymore. Quinine is in tonic water. Yes. Good point. Very little, and I don't know why. I've searched because, I go to my dad's house, and he's a big gin and tonic fan, and we'll have a gin and tonic, and I'm like, I can't have more than 2 because it's got too much quinine. Your grandma what? She drinks it for leg cramps. Leg cramps? Yeah, because of the quinine in it. Yeah. So my dad brushes me off. Ha! Quinine. I'm not sure why it has quinine in it. I've looked. Yeah. Questions? Other questions? Yeah, it's a good idea, actually, Tyler. Drinking it for leg cramps, drinking tonic water for leg cramps. Yeah. I mean, it works. Quinine works for leg cramps. It's just toxic. So tell her not to drink too much. Okay. Tonic water, I don't know, because I don't know how much quinine is in tonic water. You drink it? Really? Without gin? That's funny. That's funny. Yeah, I don't know how much is too much because I don't know how much is in it. Yeah. I mean, as long as you're not drinking a 2 liter at a time, right? Yeah. Put some gin in it. All right. All right, let's move on. Chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine structurally are exactly the same, except for hydroxychloroquine at this position has a CH2 hydroxy instead of the methyl group, so that's the only difference there structurally. Again, don't get caught up in structures. I don't care that you know anything about these, but that's the naming convention here. Okay, these are the most effective of the aminoquinoline quinine derivatives and will usually be the drug of choice for treatment of malaria. They're going to have good activity against all of the plasmodial species. The hydroxychloroquine has recently had problems with resistance, particularly in the falciparum species. So these two drugs, hydroxy being the more potent one, Plaquenil, and so we get resistance to these forming over the last 10 or 15 years, actually, okay, with hydroxy being used more, so there's more prevalence of resistance. There's minimal side effects with these, and the way they work is that they're weakly basic, and they happen to accumulate in the parasitic lysosome. So what did we say the role of the lysosome in this was? It's breaking down hemoglobin. And so if you have a weak base in the lysosome should be acidic in order to break down hemoglobin, but it's not. So it raises the pH. It raises the pH, and now that cellular trash can for the parasite can no longer break down hemoglobin, and it dies as a result of not having enough nutrients. And so the pKa is basic. It accumulates in the lysosome, raising the pH of the lysosome to more basic pH, and in a more basic pH, the organism can't break down hemoglobin to use it as a nutrient source. Remember that toxic that I told you about? It's got a hemotoxic effect that lyses the red blood cell. Well, these agents will bind that toxin as well. And so this is beneficial in preventing rupture of those red blood cells. And as we discussed earlier with entamoeba, chloroquine can be used for that. So minimal side effects here. Again, this is usually the drug of choice. So I'll go into the two side effects that are most prevalent, headache and GI disturbances. So those are things that can be expected. Headache and GI disturbance. GI disturbance typically means nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. Okay. All right, mefloquine is going to be distinguished because it is active against chloroquine-resistant Plasmodium species. Okay? So this is the way that we distinguish this agent. Rarely going to be the first drug used, but it can be used if chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine resistance is seen. And the reason why it's not used typically first is because it seems to have a higher side effect potential. Headache and GI disturbance versus seizures, suicidal tendencies, bradycardia. So this is not to say that every patient that takes it has these tendencies, but if it's noted to occur in more than 1% of patients in the trial, they have to put it on there. Okay? All right, Daraprim is another one that can be used. It's got very high affinity for the plasmodial dihydrofolate reductase. So the selectivity, because we also have dihydrofolate reductase, the selectivity comes from having 1,000-fold greater affinity for the plasmodial DHFR versus mammalian DHFR. So it's going to reduce tetrahydrofolate synthesis selectively in the plasmodium. That's going to result in deficiencies in blank, blank, and blank. I hate blanks. Purines, pyrimidines, and some amino acids, right? We talked about this with trimethoprim and sulfa. Purines, pyrimidines, and amino acids. So essentially the parasite can't replicate its DNA. It can't make protein. The use of pyrimethamine, again, can be effective for treatment and prevention of chloroquine-resistant malarias. These drugs can be used in prophylaxis. Many of you that will make trips either for APPEs or missions or Merceron missions or these type of things will take these as prophylactic agents to suppress the growth of Plasmodium during your trips. Okay? So they can be used for prophylaxis. Of course, use in prophylaxis will increase the possibility of developing resistance. All right, finally, Malarone. Malarone is a combo drug that contains adavacone, which selectively inhibits parasitic mitochondrial electron transport. What does this mean? No ATP. Okay. The other component is proguanil, which is metabolized to an active DHFR inhibitor within the parasite. Within the parasite. You can see some of the indications here. Prophylaxis for falciparum, including areas where chloroquine resistance has been reported. Treatment of acute, uncomplicated falciparum. Here's a consideration, and the consideration is with some other drugs, particularly tetracyclines, because as I show you on the next slide, tetracyclines are also useful in treatment of chloroquine-resistant falciparum. Okay? So concurrent use of this drug with tetracycline reduces the plasma concentration of this drug. Okay. So in general, treatment of malaria, first and foremost, is chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine. And then in cases where resistance occurs, we can move to these other agents, with quinine being actually the last agent. Sulfonamides and tetracyclines, if you recall, are actually also useful for malaria. And resistance can occur due to spontaneous gene mutations leading to efflux of any of the drugs or increased metabolism by the parasite. Any questions about malaria? Alex? Mm-hmm. They have usually, so when you go overseas, they give you some antibiotics. Antidiarrheal, I don't know if they give you that. Yeah, so traveler's diarrhea typically won't be caused by any bacteria. Giardia is the main cause of traveler's diarrhea. And metronidazole can be given, but you don't take those for prophylaxis. They usually give you Cipro. They usually give you metronidazole, and you take it with you. And if you get sick, then you take them, but not typically for prophylaxis. On the contrary, for malaria, they will give you something for prophylaxis. Because if you go to an endemic region, you're going to get malaria if you get bit by a mosquito. So you want to prophylact if you can. Okay? Questions? All right. Let's talk about worms. So helminths are a family of parasitic worms, and the infections of humans with helminths, this affects more than 3 billion people worldwide. There's about 7 billion people on Earth, so almost half of the world's population is infected at any given time with a parasitic worm. Now, you've all seen these symbols, and so there's stories out there. There's a couple different origins for these symbols, a couple different stories about the origins of these symbols. The one that's related to worms is the guinea worm. The guinea worm is a tiny helminth that lives in the bloodstream. And way back when, they used to have essentially witch doctors that would treat people. And so they would, the story is, they would hang a sign up with a stick with a worm wrapped around it, and this would show everyone in the village that I'm a witch doctor that can take care of your worm problem. And so what they did was essentially cut the skin and stick a stick, a tiny stick, into the blood of the vein, and as the worm makes its way down in the blood, it sticks on the stick. And then by slowly twisting the stick, it wraps around the worm, and you can take the worm out. Yeah. And so there's a couple stories about how these symbols originated, but that's the one related to the guinea worm. The guinea worm is actually, there's an article on CNN a couple weeks ago that Jimmy Carter, who is trying to eradicate guinea worm infections, and that's the Carter Center. That's one of their biggest goals for over the next couple years, is to spend enough money to eradicate guinea worm infections altogether. And so this was the first treatment for helminth infections. So if you thought that was bad, just wait. All right, so you can see the different types of helminths and the percentage of the world's population, or the numbers of infections in billions. So you add this all up, and there's pretty much half the world's population. There are three major groups of human helminth that cause infections. While all of these are not fatal, they decrease overall health. Some of them can be fatal, some of them can be very serious. They decrease overall health. And this is especially important in children, because these things rob nutrients from the human body. And in a growing child, if nutrients are robbed, you're going to get cognitive or intellectual deficiencies. Okay? So while they're not necessarily all fatal, they do have a profound impact on human health, especially in children. They are going to rob the brain and the organs of essential nutrients. I group these into three different classes: roundworms, well, the nematodes, sorry. So there's three classes: nematodes, flukes, and tapeworms, and then the nematodes are in three different classes: roundworms, hookworms, and pinworms. Now, I don't go into the individual species listed here. I have them here for you, but the way these are referred to out in the wild, in nature, in the clinic, is roundworm, hookworm, and pinworm. We don't call them by these species names. Okay? So what I want you to know is that roundworms, hookworms, and pinworms are within the nematode family. Now, flukes, also called trematodes, are caused by schistosoma species, and they infect the spleen, the GI tract, and especially the liver. And tapeworms are called cestodes, and there's two species. Taenia saginata is the beef tapeworm, and Taenia solium is the pork tapeworm. The pork tapeworm is particularly dangerous to humans, and it can cause blindness or death. The beef tapeworm is relatively harmless. It will rob nutrients from a person, but it's important to distinguish these two, because you don't want to have a pork tapeworm. So if you have a tapeworm, we need to find out what type it is, because you don't want to have the pork one. All right, so let's talk about the hookworm. I'm going to spend time on the life cycles of each. The hookworm. The larva for the hookworm is found in the soil. And typically dogs are very good carriers of hookworm, and any of you dog owners will hopefully give your dogs the worm pills, right? Once a month or once every 2 weeks, they get pills that kill off these worms. Okay? So essentially the dog defecates, has the egg that passes in the feces, and that egg can then get into another dog either by walking around, because it penetrates the skin. Okay, so these eggs, these larvae, penetrate the skin of the dog. It can also be ingested. Okay, it can also be ingested. Now, how do humans get it? Well, humans typically get it not through ingestion, but walking around barefooted. Okay? My parents told me when I was young, don't walk around barefooted, you're going to get worms. And when I remember this, I was, I don't know, 7, 8 years old. My dad had these medical books, and I looked up worms, and I was appalled by the pictures that I saw of these worms. And so I don't think I've ever walked around barefoot anywhere. It's pretty nasty. And I remember seeing something like this and thinking, holy moly, a worm can enter through my feet? That's amazing. That's really gross, actually. So yeah, this larva will actually penetrate the webbing between the toes. Okay? So yeah, don't walk around barefoot. Okay? Especially if you own a dog and you let it out in the yard and it does its thing and then you walk through the yard. Ugh, you know? So that's the main route of entry. So the larva will enter through the skin, and then it's going to make its way into the intestines. Okay, into the intestines. So the adult can live in the human intestines for 10 to 15 years if left untreated. What's it doing in the intestines? Sucking. So they've got little mouths, okay, and that mouth will attach to the wall of the intestines and just suck nutrients for 10 to 15 years if you leave it. So this can cause blood loss, it can cause anemia, and it can rob you of vital nutrients. All right, let's talk about the pinworm. The pinworm is very interesting. This is very widespread in this country. Very widespread. So are hookworms, but pinworms even more. Widespread in households as well as in institutions. They're going to live in the lumen of the GI tract where they attach with these little mouths. You see the lady and the man. They have these little mouths, and they attach to the colon or the small intestine, okay, where they suck. The female pinworms will migrate to the rectum to lay her eggs. They do this at night. And this causes tremendous pruritus. Pruritus, what is that? Itching. Itching. And this is a problem. This is the main problem, particularly with pinworm infections in kids, because kids, if they get an itch, they scratch it, right? And the scratch here is in the anal area, right? And so by scratching it, they can spread it. Okay? The female travels to the rectum at night to lay her eggs. You can diagnose this with a simple flashlight at night because the female worms are visible to the naked eye. Okay? The larva and the eggs are not, but the female worm is. The other way to diagnose it is a piece of cellophane tape attached to the rectum, and when it comes out to lay her eggs, it gets stuck on the tape. You pull the tape off and see the worms. So that's another way. Where do you get this infection? It's prevalent, person to person, and from the ground. Oh, he licked his golf balls? Yeah. Yeah. He got, yeah. So it's prevalent out in the environment. Pinworms are out in the environment. If you're licking golf balls, you could get a pinworm infection. The main ways that people get this is household contact or institutional contact. If one member of the household gets it, usually other people in the household can get it because the eggs can contaminate night clothes, bed linens. They can live there for months. Okay, so the eggs can live in the bed sheets for months. So the bed sheets have to be cleaned in hot water, washed in hot water to get rid of these eggs. The eggs are resistant to drying, so even in a dry environment, they can still sporulate. They can be inhaled in dust. So household dust, and I don't care how clean your house is, houses have dust. And so if these eggs were in the environment in the house, then they get around all over the place through the house. If you have central air and central heat, it's going to get around through that dust. They can live up to a month. Now the worst part of this can be bad. The worst part of this is that in female humans, the female worm can migrate to the vagina from when she comes to lay her eggs, and so that can cause now an infection in the vaginal tract with the worm, which is very unpleasant. All right, any questions about this? So the main problem here is with kids, because kids aren't as clean as adults, and when they get itchiness in their rear, they go to scratch it, and they may not wash their hands, and then they, give daddy a high five, or pick up the Xbox controller, and then someone else picks it up. You get the point, right? So this is an easy way for it to spread due to the fact that it causes so much itching, and kids generally can't control from the itching. All right, so that's pinworms. Let's talk about tapeworms. There are two distinct tapeworms. These are the Saginata, which is the cow. And the cow tapeworm rarely produces significant human disease other than simply robbing you of nutrients. Okay? But the pig tapeworm, the Solium, can cause very serious disease because if it attaches to the eye, which it commonly does, it can cause blindness. It can get into the brain, where it can cause seizures and psychosis. Or if it attaches to the heart, it can cause any number of cardio diseases, not necessarily cardiovascular, but it can cause arrhythmias, MI, valve problems, whatever it's attached to could be messed up. So the Solium, the pig tapeworm, has severe consequences. And so a patient is suspected of having a tapeworm infection. We need to distinguish whether it's the relatively harmless Saginata or the more harmful Solium species. So the way we get these things is simply by eating undercooked or raw meat or pork. Okay, so from a cow or from a pig. That's the only way humans can get this. They get it from eating off the ground. The tapeworms are in the ground, in the soil. These animals are getting in there. Raw or undercooked. And you can see here the Saginata and the Solium, they have these suckers. And the reason why they are called tapeworms is because the adults have these tape-like segments. So every time they grow a new segment of tape. Okay. And so here's an example of some of these tapeworms. This is one beef tapeworm. So you can see how long this can grow inside the human intestine. Right? This is the Solium species, so you can see its little sucker, and then you can see its individual tape sections. And then here are the suckers again, and then here's a real-life one in a Petri dish. This one is a real-life one. Well, they're all real-life, but, they're not imaged. This one is fresh. Yeah? No. These are exclusively from eating undercooked or raw. If the cow or the pig has the organism, and you don't cook that meat, and you're not going to see it, right? Unless you're cutting the meat itself, you won't see it. And so if you eat the undercooked or raw meat that has it, then you're going to get it. Yeah. Steak too. Steak comes from cow. Sorry? You can't eat rare steak? I guess not, unless you want a tapeworm. Now, Joanne? It has nothing to do with barefootedness. No. Oh, in general? I don't know about that. So the question is it more prevalent? Is the hookworm and pinworm more prevalent in ethnic groups that walk around barefoot? I don't know. What I do know is that there's a huge market for tapeworms as weight loss methods. I would not suggest this. You can Google it. People actually buy tapeworms on the internet and purposefully ingest them to rob their nutrients so that they lose weight. Yeah. This is a billion-dollar industry. Yeah. And it's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. Yeah. Any other questions about the tapeworm? See, this lecture always stimulates. What happened? Oh. If they don't get that big when you buy them. They start small. All right, let's move on. So how do we treat these infections? These are very diverse, as you've seen, very diverse groups of helminths. The drug therapy is shown on this one slide. Okay, so this is essentially how we treat them. Mebendazole and albendazole, ivermectin, praziquantel, and pyrantel pamoate are the drugs that I've shown you here on this table, and the check marks represent which drugs will target which worm. Okay, so it all boils down to this as far as the spectrum goes. This is a little bit challenging because we're not used to talking about these drugs, and we're not used to talking about these worms. Okay, so spend some time with this. The one exception is this river blindness. I have it in here. I'm not really going to focus on it any. Okay, so focus on these hookworms, pinworms, roundworms, and then of course the tapeworms. The schistosomes, we don't really talk about it either. Praziquantel is the drug of choice there. Okay, so the drugs can have a very broad spectrum, or they can have a very narrow spectrum. Some of you that have dogs probably give your dogs some of these, particularly ivermectin. Okay, so ivermectin is in the HeartGuard category. I think it's marketed as HeartGuard. One of the HeartGuards. I think there's a couple. So let's talk about these drugs. Mebendazole and albendazole belong to the same class of benzimidazoles. Vermox has actually been discontinued by the manufacturer, and this is not due to any safety or efficacy issues. It's just that albendazole has taken the market share, and there's not a need to have Vermox on the market according to the manufacturer. So they still dispense it. It's still out there, but the manufacturer, as of this year, is not making any more. And so as the current stock that's out there is dispensed, there will be no more. Okay? So Vermox is still available to you if you're out in the world, but at some point it's going to run out, and then we'll just have albendazole. Okay? These drugs affect helminth microtubule assembly, and you can see the microtubules here. We've talked about microtubules and their roles. The microtubules are involved in some of these things down here. Microtubules provide the cytoskeleton, right? So the actin is a microtubule, for example. And so they provide the helminth cytoskeleton through the microtubules. Microtubules are also important in helminth mitosis, just like in human mitosis. So the microtubules will be involved in pulling of the chromosomes away from each other, forming the centromeres. Okay? So these things are also involved in cellular trafficking, moving of something from one side of the cell or one side of the worm to the other. So those are the three things: mitosis, cellular trafficking, and the cytoskeleton. Microtubules are typically made up of alpha and beta tubulins, as you see here. So here's alpha tubulins in green, and the beta tubulins are in the pinkish color, and they kind of intertwine with each other to form this tubule. And so what these drugs do is they inhibit the microtubule assembly by binding to the helminth beta tubulin. They bind the beta tubulin of the worm with higher affinity than they bind beta tubulin of humans. So that's essentially how they work. If you bind beta-tubulin, the microtubules can't do all those things we said. They can't regulate trafficking of cellular proteins. They can't regulate the cytoskeleton and uphold it. And they can't regulate the DNA effects for mitosis. The secondary mechanism includes inhibition of Helminth mitochondrial fumarate reductase. This means ATP generation. There's a lot of words there, and I typically don't get into the next slide here. You guys have seen this before, but essentially down here we have fumarate reductase, which is an enzyme that's responsible for breakdown of NADH to NAD and generation of ATP. So that's, if you care, that's what we're talking about. Essentially, the Helminth generation of ATP is blocked. How does resistance occur to these benzimidazoles? Two major mechanisms. Reduced affinity, so the reduction in that high affinity binding of the drug to beta-tubulin, because beta-tubulin changes itself. It can change from a type 1 to a type 2, or it can mutate. And so it's been seen where a single beta-tubulin phenylalanine mutates to a tyrosine at this position, and then you lose binding of the drugs. Okay, so a simple phenylalanine to tyrosine mutation, and you lose binding of the drugs. Now, I'll remind you the difference between phenylalanine and tyrosine is one hydroxy group. Okay, so this very simple mutation, and you lose binding of your drug. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these. They're pretty easy if you spend some time reading over the slides. I'm not going to get into details mechanistically about these. Ivermectin is a semi-synthetic derivative of a Streptomyces soil bacteria product. It is an insecticide that's used for treatment of crops. It's also used in veterinary medicine to a very high degree. So for treatment of livestock as well as domestic dogs and cats and such. It's going to have excellent activity against the roundworm and the pinworm. And it's also the drug of choice for that river blindness. Okay? River blindness is the second leading cause of infectious blindness. We don't see it in America. We don't have it here, so I'm not going to focus on it at all. I just introduce it to you. It's caused by this Onchocerca volvulus, which is a worm. So the way ivermectin, you can see how big the structure is, the way ivermectin works is that it essentially paralyzes the organism. It paralyzes the organism, and it does so by binding to a glutamate-gated chloride channel. And this channel is only found in invertebrates like these worms. And this channel is also highly expressed in the nematodal pharyngeal muscles. And so if you paralyze these pharyngeal muscles, then the nematode can't feed as well. And if it can't feed as well, it detaches and either dies or it's excreted in the feces, depending on if it's in the intestines. So the way this works is that there's a channel. This channel is, again, selective. It's a selective target. It's only found in invertebrates. And it causes the influx of chloride. And if you inhibit this channel, then you inhibit this influx of chloride. So what does this remind you of in humans? GABA. So it's comparable to our GABA receptors. So if you inhibit this, you cause paralysis of the organism. Now we talked about in the table, ivermectin is good for pinworms and roundworms, as well as this river blindness. Pinworms and roundworms, but not hookworms or anything else. And the reason why is these organisms do not have that channel. So they're intrinsically resistant. Okay? So the organisms that it doesn't work against don't have this chloride channel. All right, let's take a break.